So, David, you have two pieces out this week at the American Prospect, as is well, I imagine you have a lot more, but there's two in particular I want to discuss. Um, this one about pharma and about how conservative House Democrats are actually protecting drug company profits. But then I also want to talk about and broaden out and talk about the other piece that you wrote about the battle for progressive policy going through Congress and the various pitfalls, some of which were really on display. If those folks, if folks out there watch Bloomberg News enough, they would probably have come across it. But before we get there, let's talk about this letter that 11 Democrats have written in support for a drug patent provision in the, for lack of a better term, NAFTA update that most Democrats oppose. And I want to talk about well, first off, what's the letter?
Yeah.
What is this update?
Yeah. Let's back up. So the administration last year signed this agreement with Mexico and Canada that would update NAFTA. It's called the USMCA, or the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And for the last year, they've been trying to persuade Democrats to get on board with it, because really it would only come up for a vote at the discretion of the Speaker, of Nancy Pelosi. And there are many things in the agreement that Democrats oppose and want to see changed. And they've been negotiating with the U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, on those points. And one of the biggest sticking points is on pharmaceuticals. So in the new NAFTA, in the USMCA, there is a 10-year exclusivity period for a certain type of very high-cost drug known as a biologic. That is actually a lower exclusivity than the 12 years we have in the United States, but it's significantly higher than what's in Canada or Mexico. And this is just rent-seeking, right? This is just protectionism. This is saying that you, drug companies, now have 10 years of essentially monopoly power to earn profits exclusively off this drug treatment without allowing generics to compete with you. And this is in the bill, and there are two problems that Democrats have with it. Number one, obviously, it raises those walls in Mexico and Canada and will make it more difficult for Mexicans and Canadians to access life-saving medications. Number two, it sets a bar within a trade agreement such that the United States, if it wanted to go below 10 years, might not be able to do so because they're locked in to an agreement with Mexico and Canada that says it's 10 years. So those are the two problems with it. And the Democrats have been negotiating with Lighthizer over these points. And so here comes this letter from 11 moderate Democrats essentially supporting the Lighthizer position, the Trump position, on this provision on pharmaceuticals. So they are undermining this negotiation. There's a negotiation going on between Democrats and the Trump administration, and here's a bunch of Democrats coming in on the side of the Trump administration. It gives the Trump administration a much stronger hand in this negotiation.
And one of the Democrats is Sherry Bustos, who is the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee.
She's not named on the letter, but however, what I would say is that 6 of the members who are on the letter I'm sorry, 4 of them are freshman Democrats, and Sherry Bustos, the head of the DCCC, and she is in charge of getting freshman members reelected. I mean, that's a large part of her job. A lot of these members are in seats that might be vulnerable to not just being in a swing district, but primary challenges. And the DCCC usually comes in and tries to support incumbent candidates in those races. And so while Bustos isn't on the bill, she has been very loudly supporting bringing this agreement to the floor and giving it the vote. Whether the change that most Democrats are making the agreement or not. In fact, what she said in The Intercept is that unions and progressives, quote, will have to get over it if the agreement reaches the floor without the kinds of changes that they seek. So Bustos, while not on this letter, is very implicated in this whole thing of essentially undermining a negotiating position.
I mean, we're doing all this. She's saying that unions and progressives and whatnot are going to have to eat it over 6 Democrats. I mean,
right, over 11 in all, but yes. There is this philosophy clearly from a lot of the leadership that the caucus has to go in the direction of its rightmost members, they have to show that those members are getting things done in Congress, working together in a bipartisan fashion. The idea, in my view, that some swing state or swing seat Democrat is going to get credit for passing a free trade agreement, particularly one that has implications for higher drug prices, it doesn't make any sense to me. But there is this sort of disease in Washington that says you have to, show bipartisanship in order to win re-election. And this trade agreement has now gotten caught up in that discussion.
How real, how sincere is this? I mean, because this is going to be relevant for our our conversation after the break. But how sincere is this? I mean, is there a genuine belief that you need to show some of these voters in there that you're willing to work with Republicans and therefore they're going to vote for you instead of the Republican? Like, how sincere is that belief? Because to me, it sounds bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's sincere is that pharmaceutical companies would really like this provision to pass, and pharmaceutical companies have the ability to spend lots of money either on Republicans fighting Democrats for those seats or on Democrats directly. And by placating them with a trade agreement that speaks to their desires, you neutralize that potential source of funding against you, or you create a source of funding for you. And this has been the sort of democratic way of the world since the 1980s, since it became a party that chases big money. And those calculations are never far from the surface, especially when you're talking about something like a trade agreement, which has a coalition essentially of industry in support of it, and often at the expense of workers and consumers.
And I guess the thing that I still find stunning, and we will talk about this on the other side of the break, is if the Democratic Party has to give up a huge concession, right? I mean, drug prices, this is a top line thing. Right. And if progressives and unions are going to eat it, why are they doing it? Let's say all 11 of them lost their seats because of this, which I find hard to believe, but let's assume that that's the case.
Right.
You still have a Democratic majority, and you have one theoretically that would be more durable because you're actually delivering the goods to the progressives and unions that you almost admit by default, are driving the success of the party. This is the USMCA. It's the sort of the updated NAFTA provision. The Democratic caucus largely against it, or I should say, at least they're
against certain provisions of it. Yeah.
This provision would essentially protect drug company profits. But it is indicative of a larger problem that I think Nancy Pelosi made clear to all of us this week, where she went on Bloomberg television, basically undercut. I mean, I have two problems with this. And we won't get to the first problem. We'll talk about the second problem, which is, how do progressive policies get through a Congress with Nancy Pelosi? But Nancy Pelosi jumped into the 2020 Democratic primary this week, and I don't think that it was terribly, frankly, I mean, it was definitely unhelpful, but I think she should have been taking a lot more flack for this than she did when she basically came out and said, Medicare for all, no way. And on top of that, we got to pay for every progressive policy that we have, an offset so that it's revenue neutral, essentially. And that is also basically saying, yeah, all this stuff that's aspirational, we're not going to do it unless it's really small bore stuff. I mean, she's getting involved in the 2020 primary as much as she is basically laying down a gauntlet saying we're not going to do anything progressive if we get a Democratic president. I mean, what the hell?
That's the question. There's no question that she took essentially the platforms of two of the three top candidates in terms of support and trashed it. And if that's not putting their thumb on the scale at a Wasserman-Schultz 2016 level, I don't know what is. I mean, it's very clear. And you're starting to actually see other Democrats come out and do this. Earlier this week, John Tester and Joe Manchin said, no way, no how, we would never support giving up the filibuster. You've seen Manchin say that he wouldn't support Bernie Sanders over Donald Trump. This is not isolated.
Well, it's one thing when Joe Manchin says this. It's another when the Speaker of the House from San Francisco says this.
Right. She's thrown in her lot with the forces of capital, the forces of industry, who don't want dramatic change, who don't feel that it's necessary for their particular bottom lines. And one thing that I do bring up in that piece is that Nancy Pelosi is a lame duck speaker. She made this decision basically because otherwise she would not have had the votes to become speaker after the 2018 election, to say that I will serve one or two more terms as speaker. And I'm going to serve this one. And then to serve the next one from the Congress, the next Congress, 2021 and 2022, I will need the support of 2/3 of the Democratic caucus. And that's the only way I'm going to serve. So the Progressive Caucus has more than 1/3 of the total Democrats in Congress in its coalition. There is a place for them to easily say, look, you need to stop undermining our candidates and depressing the rank and file of this party and making it harder for us to turn anybody out if the idea is that nothing is going to get done, or else we will withhold our votes for you for speaker, and you can't get them without us. So, I mean, there really is a legitimate, I mean, if she's going to go play hardball like this, there is a response that can be made.
Well, do you think that the Progressive Caucus is going to do it? Because if the Progressive Caucus won't do it, then why should she care?
I mean, I think the Progressive Caucus, or at least the leadership of the Progressive Caucus, I haven't talked to everyone in it, but I think the leadership is frustrated. I did happen to talk to the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, a couple of weeks ago, And she did express frustration that certain members, who she did not name, but I think at this point Pelosi can fall into it, were using these talking points of Republicans and insurance companies in talking about Medicare for all. And she made the key point that look what happens when Democrats unite. So before Democrats and Pelosi in particular united on impeachment, there wasn't a large amount of support for it within the public. The numbers were, in the 30s, basically, for impeachment. As soon as Pelosi changed and said, yes, we're going to start an inquiry, those numbers jumped 10, 15 points.
Yep.
And it's amazing what happens when Democrats are actually united and speak with one voice on these things.
But doesn't Prayapal saying
that
that
with these other issues?
Yes, except for but there is a difference, and that is impeachment really is purely political and civic, whereas Medicare for all involves the interests of big corporations. And so when Nancy Pelosi is doing this, this isn't, with impeachment, you could make the argument of I'm worried about those frontline Democrats and blah, blah, blah. And it's possible you could make that argument about Medicare for all. But when her, and I think it was reported at maybe it was you, I think, who actually reported this, if I'm not mistaken, when Wendell Primus, her top advisor on healthcare, gets in front of a health conference a year and a half ago and says, we're not going to do Medicare for all. That leads me to believe that that's not a function of worrying about frontline Democrats, none of whom existed at that time, really, because the wave had not happened. But really, it's more about who's paying my bills or what my political predisposition is.
Yeah, as I said, Nancy Pelosi has put herself on the side of capital. She has put herself on the side of industry, and she has said, "This is where I'm going to stay." And it's up to those who don't agree with that stance to find a way around it.